A pale light spread across the Quai des Orfèvres, half absorbed by the fog that rose from the Seine. It was the hour when Paris seemed suspended, its sounds muffled, its people still lingering between dream and waking. Behind the large windows of the police headquarters, a figure sat motionless, pipe balanced between his teeth, eyes following the swirl of smoke as if it might sketch the outline of an answer not yet known. Inspector Maigret had grown accustomed to silences heavier than words, to corridors echoing with secrets, and to the peculiar weight of human souls pressing against him long before confessions were spoken. This morning, however, there was something different in the air. Not the heaviness of routine, nor the quiet dread of a case unfolding, but the strange sense that a figure had entered his world quietly, leaving only a trace of scent and shadow. Somewhere in Paris, perhaps in a cafe still fragrant with last night's tobacco, perhaps in a boarding house behind shuttered windows, a stranger in yellow gloves was waiting. As you let yourself sink into this atmosphere, following Maigret through misty streets and smoky cafes, consider keeping this journey alive by lending it your presence. A gesture as simple as subscribing or sharing ensures the lamps stay lit and the fog continues to whisper stories across the Seine. The morning began with a grey drizzle that flattened the cobblestones along the Quai des Orfèvres and blurred the outlines of the barges moored on the river. From his office window, Maigret watched the rain gather in thin rivulets against the glass, the blurred shapes of pedestrians hurrying past, collars raised, umbrellas opening like dark flowers in the mist. The city, as it often did, seemed wrapped in its own secrets, and the inspector, pipe glowing faintly between his teeth, felt the familiar hush before Paris awoke fully. Behind the fog, behind the steady murmur of water and wheels, he sensed the presence of something unaccounted for, an intrusion that could not yet be named. At this hour, the clerks at the quay shuffled papers more than they spoke, their pens scratching softly, their typewriters clicking at irregular intervals. Maigret's bulk occupied the armchair as naturally as if it were carved to his form, his hat hanging on its peg, his heavy overcoat damp from the morning air. He did not fidget. He simply watched, pipe smoke coiling upward and dispersing in the gloom. A telephone bell rang briefly in another office and was silenced. Somewhere a file drawer screeched, yet his attention clung stubbornly to the river, as though the current itself might deliver a sign. The stranger entered Maigret's world quietly, almost insignificantly. At first, it was only the description offered by a patrolman, a young man who had stopped by to warm himself with a coffee in the police canteen. He mentioned, almost absently, that he had noticed a curious figure crossing Pont Saint-Michel in the early dawn, a tall silhouette, neither hurried nor idle, marked only by a pair of yellow gloves that gleamed faintly even in the rain. Maigret had heard hundreds of such observations before, trifles that led nowhere, and yet his pipe paused in mid-draw. Yellow gloves in the grey of Paris morning were like a flare against monotony. No crime had yet been committed, no body discovered, no complaint lodged at the desk downstairs. And still, Maigret felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the quiet tug that told him a thread had been thrown across his path, inviting him to follow. He asked no questions of the patrolman. He merely let the remark sink into him. A stone dropped into a deep pond. Hours later, when the drizzle had lifted and Paris emerged slick and gleaming, he found his thoughts circling back to that silhouette, that unnatural colour clinging to a pair of gloves. By midday, the cafes along Boulevard Saint-Germain had filled with their usual clientele. Waiters balancing trays, students arguing over newspapers, clerks snatching quick lunches before returning to offices that smelled of ink and dust. Maigret left headquarters without a word, hat pulled low, coat collar raised. He walked with his usual heavy tread, the kind that seemed to press the stones deeper into the earth. To the casual observer he appeared a man on no special errand, but inside him a compass had begun to turn. He entered cafes, paused by zinc counters, ordered beer or coffee he barely touched, and let his eyes wander. He was not looking for a man in yellow gloves so much as the tremor left behind by his passage. It was in a small cafe near Odeon that the first echoes surfaced. A waiter, drying glasses with a cloth, recalled serving a solitary man earlier that morning. He remembered the gloves. Oh, how could one not? They were bright against the damp wood of the counter, and the man had kept them on even while drinking. He had spoken little, paid in exact change, and left no trace except the unease of colour. Maigret nodded without expression, thanked the man, and stepped back into the street. The drizzle had stopped, but the air remained saturated, as though the city itself exhaled secrecy. From one cafe to the next, from market stalls where women bargained over vegetables to tobacconists where customers lit their first pipes of the day, the inspector listened. Some had noticed the gloves, others had not. Some swore they had seen them yesterday, or last week, or perhaps only dreamed of them. Memory in Paris was fluid, facts dissolving easily into rumour. Yet Maigret persisted, knowing that even the vaguest recollection added weight to a shadow. The hours drifted by. The city swelled with movement, trams clanging, horses pulling carts, bells ringing faintly from churches, and still, always in the background, that flicker of yellow persisted, as though Maigret's own mind painted it across the crowd. He found himself thinking of the gloves in the way he might think of a scent, or the faint lingering of perfume in a hallway after its wearer had vanished. Who was this stranger who moved so inconspicuously and yet left behind such vivid residue? By late afternoon, Maigret stopped at a bistro near the Seine, where the windows clouded with steam and the air was heavy with wine and tobacco. He ordered a glass of white and took his time with it, pipe set aside, eyes half-lidded. At a table nearby, 2 students were discussing an article from the morning's paper. Voices animated, but in the flow of their chatter a phrase caught his ear. "Les gants jaunes." They laughed, dismissing it as nothing more than a curiosity they had noticed on a passer-by. But for Maigret it was confirmation. The gloves were real, and the city was beginning to speak of them, if only in half-sentences. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were being lit, the corridors echoing with the day's weariness. Janvier met him at the door, a file in hand, expecting some instruction. But Maigret brushed past, muttering only for the young inspector to listen for anything unusual. In his office once more, he sank heavily into the chair, relit his pipe, and let the smoke drift in slow spirals. He had gathered almost nothing tangible, no name, no address, no crime. And yet the stranger existed as palpably in his mind as if he had interrogated him already. Maigret's gift was not clairvoyance, but patience. He knew the city, knew its rhythms, knew how a single dissonant note lingered until it resolved into something unmistakable. He had seen it often. A woman staring too long at a window, a man returning each day to the same cafe at the same hour, a boy who whistled too cheerfully in the grey dawn. All were small ruptures in the fabric of normalcy, and all eventually unravelled into stories, sometimes tragic, sometimes banal, but always human. The yellow gloves were no different. They belonged to someone, and that someone carried a story heavy enough to ripple through Paris itself. The night deepened. Fog rose again from the Seine, and the barges' lanterns flickered faintly on the water. In his office, Maigret remained still, pipe warm in his hand, coat hanging patiently on its peg. Outside, Paris bustled with its million lives, none aware that a stranger had already entered its bloodstream, gliding silently, marked only by the flash of yellow. Tomorrow, Maigret knew, there would be more. A name whispered, a trace discovered, an object found in some room left hastily behind. The city was patient too. It kept its secrets until the right pair of eyes demanded them. For now there was only the image of a man in yellow gloves crossing a bridge in the rain, a faint smile perhaps, or none at all, a shadow indistinguishable from hundreds, yet somehow unforgettable. That was enough to begin. The next morning, Paris awoke beneath a pallid sky, the colour of unpolished pewter. Overnight, drizzle had hardened into a thin crust of frost, so that the rooftops gleamed faintly in the early light, and the breath of horses clattered in clouds as they pulled carts through narrow streets. Maigret walked heavily from his apartment toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat buttoned, the collar turned against the chill. Madame Maigret had pressed a scarf into his hands at the door, and he had accepted it with his usual grunt, though his mind was elsewhere, always circling back to the stranger with the yellow gloves. At headquarters, the atmosphere was more brisk than usual. The typewriters chattered with urgency, and the faint smell of ink mingled with tobacco smoke. A clerk delivered a note to Maigret's desk, a report from a night patrol. Around midnight, a waiter on the Rue de Rennes had discovered a pair of gloves abandoned on a café table. They were yellow. The patrolman had taken them to the local commissariat, where they were now locked in a drawer, waiting for someone with patience to decide whether they were evidence or nothing at all. Maigret sat in his armchair, pipe glowing. He read the words twice, 3 times, letting them sink into him. Already the stranger's passage was leaving behind relics, fragments of himself that lingered where he had paused. Gloves left behind were no accident. They were either a signal or a shedding, the way a snake leaves its skin. He rose slowly, pulled on his heavy coat, and told Janvier to accompany him. The café was ordinary, with zinc counters, mirrors fogged from breath and steam, and chairs pushed back as though customers might return at any moment. The waiter was still shaken, still bemused by the detail that had unsettled him so. He insisted the man had sat alone, ordered a single coffee, kept the gloves on his hands while he drank, and then left abruptly. The gloves remained where he had set them, folded neatly on the table's edge, bright against the worn wood. Maigret lifted the gloves from the drawer at the commissariat. They were supple, the leather faintly cracked at the seams, well worn but carefully tended. A faint trace of perfume clung to them, though not the heavy scent of a woman's glove. It was subtler, almost medicinal, the sort of cologne a man might wear to mask the fatigue of long hours. Maigret turned them over in his broad hands, weighing them not as objects, but as confessions. A man who left behind gloves of this colour was not careless. He wished to be remembered. For the rest of that day, Maigret followed their trail. He moved from café to café, theatre to theatre, tobacconist to tobacconist, asking without asking, listening more than speaking. Sometimes the answer was a shrug, sometimes a vague nod. Yes, they thought they had seen yellow gloves, perhaps yesterday, perhaps last week. At a cinema on Boulevard Montparnasse, an usher recalled a man entering just before the last showing, gloves bright in the dim lobby. No ticket was torn. The man had turned, glanced at the posters, and left again, a presence without purpose, a shadow lingering on thresholds. Paris was full of gloves, brown leather for workmen, black for funerals, woolen for students, with threadbare coats. But yellow, they carried a defiance. They were an object meant to be seen, and those who saw them remembered not the man but the flash of colour. It was as if the gloves walked alone, detached from their owner, multiplying in recollection, until Maigret began to wonder whether he was chasing a pair of objects rather than the hands that wore them. In the late afternoon he found himself at a newspaper kiosk near the Gare Montparnasse. The vendor, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, remembered clearly. He had sold a paper to a tall stranger whose gloves were impossible to forget. The man had taken the newspaper, folded it carefully, and tucked it beneath his arm without a word. The vendor had thought nothing of it until asked. Now, telling the story, he shivered faintly as though the memory carried weight he had not felt at the time. Maigret pressed for details, the height, the coat, the hat, but the vendor shook his head. "It is the gloves I recall," he said, "only the gloves." That evening, back at the quay, Maigret sat in silence while Janvier and Lucas waited, restless, for instructions. On his desk lay the pair of gloves from the commissariat, pale against the dark wood. Maigret's gaze lingered on them as smoke drifted upward from his pipe. He wondered whether their owner still had another pair, whether he carried them in his pockets even now, waiting for the right moment to appear again. A man who left his mark in gloves was not careless, but deliberate. He wanted the city to notice, and the city was beginning to oblige. A file arrived from a provincial town, a telegram from a commissaire who had read of the strange gloves in a brief note circulated among stations. A landlady in Angoulême had complained of a lodger who arrived with little luggage, paid his rent promptly, and wore yellow gloves whenever he left the building, even in summer heat. He had departed abruptly a month earlier, leaving behind no forwarding address. The telegram contained only this and a vague description. Tall, neither thin nor stout, age uncertain. Maigret let the telegram fall onto the desk. Already the gloves had begun to travel, to appear in provinces and in Paris, multiplying like an echo through time. Was it the same man, or many? Was the city inventing him as the newspapers invented figures when facts ran thin? The inspector was no stranger to the elasticity of memory, the way witnesses imposed order on chaos, colour on shadows. Yet the persistence of the gloves, the fact that they reappeared in so many accounts, suggested more than invention. That night, Maigret lingered by the river before returning home. The Seine glistened black beneath the lamps, barges moored in silence, the occasional ripple lapping against, stone embankments. He drew his coat tighter, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes narrowing at the reflection of lights trembling on the water. Somewhere in the city, the stranger walked still, the gloves bright against the darkness, brushing against counters, resting on tables tucked into pockets. Maigret could almost feel their touch on the world, an intimate intrusion. The case had not yet formed. There was no crime, no accusation, only fragments and whispers. Yet already Maigret felt its gravity pulling him deeper, the way the faintest tug of current can draw a barge into mid-stream. Tomorrow the gloves would reappear, in a theatre perhaps, or at a market stall, or in the memory of a woman staring from her window. And Maigret would follow, not because the law demanded it, but because he could not ignore a thread once it had brushed against him. The night closed in. The gloves rested on his desk at the quay, pale against the darkness, silent, waiting for the story they were bound to tell. The morning carried a pale brightness that turned Paris into a city traced in chalk, edges softened, voices low. From his office, Maigret watched the first wagons lumber along the quay and felt the tug of a direction not entirely chosen. The gloves had left traces like pollen on the air, settling in cafes and kiosks, on theatre lobbies and zinc counters, but the thread he needed lay elsewhere, away from the river's breath. He unfolded the telegram again, the one from Angoulême, its words economical, the ink faintly smudged by a careless thumb. A landlady, a lodger with yellow gloves, an abrupt departure. He could have sent Janvier to look into it, could have waited, collected more fragments in Paris where the stranger seemed content to be rumour. Instead, he took his hat from its peg, pressed the brim to reshape it, and told Lucas to inform Madame Maigret that he would be gone a night, perhaps 2. He disliked leaving Paris, disliked trains with their overheated compartments and their odd intimacy, but the picture forming in his mind insisted on a provincial window and a woman whose eyes had learned to stare far beyond the street. By early afternoon he had taken his seat in a second-class carriage bound south, the compartment smelling faintly of coal dust and old upholstery. A travelling salesman with a valise full of samples snored softly, lips parted, while opposite a nun knitted calmly, her needles glinting each time the train slipped from shadow to light. Maigret watched the landscape unspool, flat fields glazed with frost, small stations where porters stamped their feet and blew into their hands, villages huddled close to their steeples. The rhythm of the train encouraged a different kind of thinking, not the shuffle and press of Parisian streets, but a slower settling of elements, each thought finding its weight. He knocked ash gently from his pipe into an empty matchbox and let the smell of tobacco anchor him in a space that was neither here nor there. Angoulême received him with a chill and the discreet bustle of a town that minded its own concerns. The commissaire met him in a cramped office off the main square, its walls hung with yellowed notices and a map pinned with brass tacks. He was a small man with quick eyes that gave him a nervous air, respectful without obsequiousness. He offered a handshake, a chair, and a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. They spoke briefly, the facts arranged without adornment. The landlady was named Madame Briand, a widow with a face cut thin by thrift. The house was on Rue des Orfèvres, not without irony, a narrow street where shutters often remained half-closed even at noon. The lodger had arrived near the end of summer with a small suitcase and a reserve that did not shade entirely into secrecy. He paid promptly each Monday, left early, returned late, and wore, even in heat, a pair of yellow gloves. They walked together to the lodging-house. The town's quiet seemed made of stone, short steps worn smooth, door-knockers polished by generations of hands, iron railings with a bloom of rust like dried blood. Madame Briand opened at once when they knocked, as though she had been listening at the door, and gave a little start when Maigret's bulk filled her threshold. She was small and neat, a dark dress cinched at the waist, a key-ring at her belt that clinked softly when she moved. Her hair was arranged without vanity, and her eyes were the eyes Maigret had expected, watchful, with that particular shine born of counting pennies and measuring strangers. He asked few questions. He let her speak, and she did, not fluently, but with the halts and retrees of someone extracting the truth from beneath daily habit. The lodger's name had been entered as Monsieur André, no surname given, no papers, beyond a card with a Paris address that proved to be a poste restante when the commissaire investigated. He had chosen the room on the second floor at the back, a narrow space with a slanted ceiling and a window overlooking a small courtyard where a single plane tree stood like a survivor. A table, a chair, a narrow bed, a washstand, a trunk under the bed he never opened in her presence. He was neither flirtatious nor rude, neither chatty nor mute. And always the gloves. They were visible from the first moment, a yellow that seemed to glow in the dusk, a colour she had come to dread because it suggested a story she could not read. Maigret asked to see the room. Madame Briand hesitated a fraction of a second, the way a person does who has already tidied away what she should not have touched. then led them up a staircase whose runner betrayed long poverty in the thinness of its nap. The corridor smelled faintly of dust and boiled cabbage that was not being cooked at the moment, but had lived too long in the walls. She unlocked the door and stood aside, one hand still on the key, as though unwilling to surrender the room, even for an instant. It was bare, as promised, but not empty of presence. A man leaves himself in the way a chair is pushed back, in the faint ring a glass makes on wood, in the stubborn curl of a hair caught in a brush. The bed was neatly made, the cover pulled tight, the pillows fluffed to so precise a plumpness that the gesture felt more masculine than feminine, a soldier's tidiness. The washstand held a cracked pitcher, a bar of soap reduced to a translucent wafer, and a straight razor with its blade wiped too carefully. On the small table lay nothing but the shadow of where something had recently been. Maigret crossed to the window and looked out over the courtyard. The plane tree's branches were bare, offering a dozen delicate scratches to the grey sky. He did not speak for a while. The silence he kept was not emptiness, but a way of listening to the room. He relit his pipe, drew in the first mouthful of smoke, and let it dissolve slowly. The commissaire shifted his weight. Madame Brion's key ring clicked and fell quiet. When Maigret finally turned, he asked to see whatever the landlady had not yet shown them. She bristled, only for an instant, then produced from her apron pocket a handkerchief folded into neat quarters. Inside lay a single button the colour of old ivory, and beside it a leather thread snapped at one end, the yellow dyed through. She had found them after he left, she said, the morning after his abrupt departure, and had put them aside without knowing why. He had departed with the haste of a man who knows the hour of a train, leaving the rent paid to the end of the week, and nothing that could fix him to the place but impressions. He had gone out the night before with the gloves on, and returned without them, his hands bare for the first time she had ever seen. She had been standing at her window facing the street when he came in, and she had noticed not the lack of gloves, but the way he hid his hands as if they embarrassed him. Later, when she entered to straighten the room, she found the button and the broken thread wedged between the chair and the table leg. She had meant to throw them away. She said this quickly, as if to absolve herself of any intention, and had not. The button was ordinary, the sort used on men's shirts bought by the dozen. The leather thread, though, did not belong to a shirt. It had the faint chemical smell of dyed hide, the same smell that had clung to the gloves in Paris when Maigret held them in his hands, subtle, nearly medicinal. He rolled it between thumb and forefinger. It had been tied and untied often, the kink remembered fingers. A thread from a wrist strap, from the inner lining where a man might fasten something small, or from a loop used to hang the gloves on a hook. He said none of this aloud. He only nodded and asked what the lodger had done in his hours here, whether he received visitors, whether his bed had the look of a man who slept at regular hours or at none. Madame Brion said he almost never slept before dawn. She had observed it not by spying, but by the simple fact of a house that creaks differently when a man is awake. She had heard the faint scrape of a chair, the pacing of a heavy step, the grind of a match being drawn. Sometimes she had seen him, late, at the window, not looking out as much as leaning near it, as if the air cooled him. During the day he left. Always he left. No visitors, no friends, no letters. Only once had she noticed a woman on the street below stop and hesitate, hand on her scarf, eyes lifted as if about to signal. But she passed on again, and the lodger did not show his face. The commissaire watched Maigret as if the inspector might name the woman, conjure her as simply as the smoke conjured serpents in the air. But Maigret was not in the habit of filling gaps with stories. He walked once around the room, his shoulder briefly brushing the slanted wall, and stopped with his hand on the back of the chair. There was no ash in the cold grate, no scent of soup or wine or cheap cologne. Yet the air had a residue of vigilance, as if the room itself had kept watch with its occupant. He asked to see the staircase landing. On the banister, at shoulder height, a faint smudge of yellow clung where a hand might naturally steady itself. It could have been sunlight remembered in wood. It could have been nothing at all. He touched it, and his finger came away clean. As they left the room, Madame Brillon paused, then led them, without being asked, down the back stairs to the courtyard. Against the wall there was a low bench. From this angle, the window of the lodger's room opened like a silent mouth. On the bench, the cement bore a faint oval mark, 2 dark arcs where something had rested in damp weather. She had seen him sit there once, she said, late, hands clasped, his face turned upward, as if he were waiting for a sign from a sky that had none to give. She had recognized him only by the gloves, which gleamed even beneath the courtyard's shadows. He had not returned after that night, and the bench had kept the shape of his absence through rain and sun as stubbornly as a bruise. Evening crept into the town while they stood there. The commissaire cleared his throat and asked, not unkindly, what it meant. Maigret shook his head. Meaning was a harvest that ripened at its own pace. He asked for the key to the room to be left with him until morning, and the commissaire nodded, and Madame Brillon, after a conflict visible in the set of her mouth, accepted it. He spent another hour alone in the room as the light faded, the plane tree's bare fingers blackening against the sky. He did nothing that could be called work. He sat and allowed the room to shape his thoughts, let the forms of absence settle around him, and somewhere in that settling he understood, not a fact, but a rhythm. The man was a creature of thresholds, lobbies, kiosks, benches, windows, places one passes through, places one never fully inhabits. The gloves were not vanity, but a tether, a way of existing even while refusing the weight of a name. He returned to the commissariat, where a telegram waited. Paris had breathed again. A waiter near the Odéon remembered the stranger from the previous night, late, with bare hands at last, fingernails trimmed close, a stiffness in the fingers as though they were newly ungloved and learning the air. He had asked for a glass of water and then left without touching it. On the table, after he went, they found a single yellow thread under the rim of the glass, caught like a hair. Maigret stared at the words and felt the line tighten between town and city, between the woman at the window and the fog along the Seine. He pocketed the telegram, thanked the commissaire for his patience and his poor coffee, and walked slowly back toward the lodging-house, where the corridor held its breath and the second-floor room murmured of a man in motion. Outside, the town's lamps had bloomed in their little halos, and the night smelled faintly of smoke and damp stone, and something else he could not yet name. He paused in the courtyard and looked up at the window. It reflected nothing but the darkness, as if the glass had swallowed even the memory of the man who stood behind it. He would return to Paris with the button and the leather thread and the impression of a posture more revealing than any declaration. The woman at the window had not been waiting for the lodger's return. She had been waiting for him to vanish in a manner that made sense. People did that sometimes, moved through rooms like a change in weather, leaving behind, in place of themselves, a trace for others to read. The yellow gloves had taught the city to look, the bare hands would teach it to doubt what it saw. The train would leave at dawn. He would sleep badly in a hotel that smelled of damp linen and old wood, and he would dream, perhaps, of a pair of hands, learning how to be visible. And in Paris, long before he arrived, a new clue would surface in the humblest of places, where coffee cooled and newspapers shed their ink onto fingers, and the river carried every rumour like a confidant too discreet to speak. The train carried him back into Paris at an hour when the city was still stirring, the lamps pale against the first grey of morning. Maigret stepped down onto the platform with the weariness of a man who had travelled less in distance than in atmosphere, carrying with him the residue of a provincial room, a landlady's cautious eyes, and a pair of objects that could not yet be called clues, one broken thread, one button. The station echoed with footsteps and announcements, the shuffle of travellers heading toward waiting cabs or trams, but for Maigret each sound seemed muffled, as though the city itself were listening with him for what the gloves would reveal next. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the air had already thickened with smoke and the clatter of typewriters. Files passed from desk to desk, clerks hurried with carbon copies, and Janvier arrived breathless with a note in hand. A café near the Place de l'Odéon had reported something odd. Not theft, not violence, not even a quarrel. Only a collection of cigarette ends left on a saucer and a cup of coffee that remained untouched, its surface still steaming when the waiter returned to clear the table. In any other season, it would have been nothing. But these were days when Paris whispered about yellow gloves, and silence itself became suspicious. Maigret walked there slowly, pipe clenched in his teeth, heavy steps striking sparks of familiarity from the pavement. The café was modest, a corner establishment with mirrors darkened by age, a counter of dull zinc, and tables scarred by generations of elbows. The waiter led him at once to the table in question, near the window, its view partially obscured by condensation. On the saucer were 5 cigarette ends crushed with care, not hurriedly stubbed out, but pressed precisely, their filters aligned as though their owner disliked disorder even in ash. The coffee was cold now, a thin film floating on its surface, but the smell still lingered, rich and faintly bitter, mingling with the stale smoke of the room. "Alone?" Maigret asked. The waiter nodded. He described a tall man, coat-collar raised, hat low. The gloves. Yes, he had worn them when he arrived, pale against the dark wood of the chair. But when he left an hour later, he had forgotten them or chosen to abandon them, for on the seat where he had sat, the faintest trace of yellow leather remained. An impression quickly vanished when another patron claimed the chair. Maigret bent closer to the cigarettes, drawing in their scent. They were of a brand less common in Paris, rolled with tobacco slightly harsher, a provincial taste. He lifted one carefully between thumb and forefinger and studied the indentation of the teeth. Some men smoked without thought, leaving irregular marks, but here the pattern was consistent, neat, the bite of a jaw that controlled even its indulgence. A man who smokes 5 cigarettes and does not touch his coffee is a man waiting, Maigret thought, waiting for someone who does not come. Outside, the streets swelled with midday traffic, students jostling with clerks, flower vendors calling their wares, tram bells clanging. Yet in the small café corner lingered a silence heavier than noise. The untouched coffee seemed to accuse the air of withholding, the cigarettes whispered of impatience cloaked in discipline, and somewhere between the smoke and the steam, the faint image of yellow gloves flickered like a lantern glimpsed through fog. He left the café without comment, only a nod to the waiter who watched him with the curiosity reserved for men who seem to see more than is visible. On the pavement, Maigret paused, pipe smoke curling from his lips. He had spent his life among such details, the imprint of a glass ring, the crack of a match, against a wall, the way a chair stood slightly askew. Human beings, even when silent, confessed themselves endlessly to the objects around them. A glove left behind, a coffee cooling, a cigarette stubbed with precision, These were the syllables of a language Maigret had long since learned to read. By late afternoon, Lucas had gathered reports from 2 other establishments. In one, a café on Rue Monsieur le Prince, the stranger had ordered a glass of wine and left half of it untouched. In another, near the Luxembourg Gardens, he had stood at the counter, hands gloved, speaking only once to ask the time, though a clock hung in plain sight. Each time he departed without haste, without exchange, leaving behind objects that seemed to continue his presence: a glass, a cup, a stub of cigarette. Each object was ordinary, yet together they formed a chain, a trail of fragments leading deeper into the heart of the city. Maigret did not rush. He walked these places in the order of their telling, heavy tread steady, stopping at each to breathe the air, to study the counters polished by countless elbows, the mirrors reflecting faces that blurred with memory. He did not ask much. He allowed the waiters, the proprietors, the customers to volunteer what clung to their minds. Often it was little more than the gloves, but once a woman swore the man had drummed his fingers against the table, rhythmically, as if repeating a thought. Another claimed he carried a folded newspaper but never opened it, holding it the way one holds a talisman rather than a source of news. As the day waned, Paris darkened into its winter mood, lamps throwing halos against the fog, and the Seine rolling slow and black between its embankments. Maigret returned to headquarters, his coat damp with mist, his pipe cooling in his hand. On his desk now lay a collection of objects: the button from Angoulême, the leather thread, the pair of gloves recovered from the commissariat, and a small envelope containing 2 of the cigarette ends he had taken from the café. He placed them side by side, like exhibits in a silent trial, and stared at them through the smoke that rose from his relit pipe. What bound them was not yet a crime, but a rhythm, a pattern of appearances and absences. A man who sat without drinking, who smoked without distraction, who carried gloves as though they were his identity. A man who lived in thresholds, who left more behind than he carried with him. Somewhere beneath these gestures lay the story, human and frail, but its surface was still smooth, resistant, like the river that revealed only reflections. Janvier entered quietly, waiting for instruction, but Maigret only raised a hand for patience. He was listening still, not to words, but to the city, to the way Paris breathed when watched closely. Tomorrow, he thought, there would be more: another table, another trace, another room where silence spoke louder than speech. And he would follow, pipe smoke curling, like a question without an answer. Night settled fully, the Quai des Orfèvres hushed, except for the shuffle of papers and the distant ring of a telephone. Outside, the city carried on with its million lives, each as ordinary as a coffee cup, each as singular as a cigarette stub. Somewhere in that vastness the stranger walked, bare-handed or gloved, leaving behind objects that demanded to be read. And Maigret, leaning in his armchair, eyes half closed, understood that he had entered a story that would not yield quickly, that each fragment would deepen the fog rather than clear it. Yet that was his element, the fog, the half-light, the mystery of ordinary things that refused to remain silent. The coffee cooled further, the cigarettes crumbled to ash. And in Maigret's mind the gloves rested still, folded neatly, awaiting the moment when their silence would finally break. The Seine was swollen from days of winter rain, its surface restless beneath a shroud of mist. Barges moored along the embankments groaned faintly in the current, their lanterns flickering like weary eyes. It was morning, and the river carried on its breath the mingled scents of damp rope, coal smoke, and the faint tang of refuse swept in from the markets. Maigret leaned on the stone parapet near Pont-Neuf, pipe clenched firmly, watching the slow procession of water as though it might confess what it had swallowed. He had seen it before, the way Paris whispered through its river, secrets drifting downstream before words were spoken, rumours swelling long before facts reached the Quai des Orfèvres. The first murmur came from the mouths of bargemen, men with weathered faces and caps pulled low, who lived half their lives in the rhythm of currents. One claimed he had seen something heavy cast into the water near Saint-Cloud, wrapped in canvas, sinking quickly before the ripples could spread. Another swore that at dawn a shape had risen briefly near the Île de la Cité, pale and smooth, before slipping beneath again. None spoke with certainty, but all repeated the same note. The presence of yellow gloves glimpsed on the embankment, the colour incongruous against stone and fog. At the markets along the riverfront, fishmongers told their own version. A vendor, wiping scales from his hands, said he had heard from a cousin who worked the docks that a pair of gloves had been found caught in a net, waterlogged but unmistakably yellow. When pressed, the cousin denied it, insisting the story was invention. Yet the rumour clung stubbornly, passed from stall to stall with the same persistence as the smell of fish in the air. Maigret moved slowly among these voices, listening more than questioning, his heavy figure inconspicuous only because the city had grown used to his presence. He knew how rumour worked in Paris. Like the river, it carried debris of truth mingled with weeds of invention. To ignore it entirely was folly, to believe it outright was worse. But somewhere in its shifting currents, if one listened long enough, the weight of fact revealed itself. In the smoky warmth of a riverside bistro where sailors warmed their hands over glasses of cheap brandy, the gloves were already legend. A young deckhand swore he had seen them lying on the steps at dawn, left behind as though shed in haste. Another claimed the gloves belonged to a drowned woman, though no woman's body had been found. They spoke with conviction born not of evidence, but of need, for the river always demanded stories to explain its silences. Maigret sat among them, silent, drawing on his pipe, watching their faces as much as listening to their words. Behind each tale lay the human impulse to shape fear into narrative. The yellow gloves had become the perfect vessel for such invention, bright enough to fix the imagination, empty enough to accept any meaning. That afternoon, word reached the quay of a discovery near Bercy. A bundle of rags, sodden and foul-smelling, had been pulled from the water by dock workers unloading wine barrels. Inside, no body, no blood, nothing but discarded cloth heavy with river silt. Yet one of the men insisted that when he first glimpsed it, he saw the flash of yellow leather among the folds. By the time police arrived, nothing remained but the wet stink of cloth and the river's slow laughter. Maigret stood at the edge of the quay where the bundle had been lifted. The water lapped indifferently at the stones, carrying with it fragments of wood, a child's ball, the pale skin of an orange peel. He squatted, touched the damp stones where the bundle had rested, and let his mind travel with the current. If the stranger wished to disappear, the river was his ally. If he wished to haunt the city, it was his stage. The Seine could erase as easily as it revealed, swallowing evidence, then returning only rumour. Back at headquarters, the atmosphere thickened. Journalists had begun to call, sniffing at the edges of the story, their questions wrapped in mock innocence. Had there been a discovery near the river? Was it true a pair of gloves had been found? Were the police investigating a disappearance? The presses were hungry, and Paris, already unsettled by winter gloom, was eager for mystery. Maigret answered none of it. He sat in his office, smoke wreathing his head, listening to the hum of typewriters and the restless shuffle of detectives who wanted orders. He gave none. Instead, he returned to the river at dusk, walking the embankment slowly, pausing at each staircase that descended to the water. Barges floated like dark houses, their inhabitants visible through small lit windows. Women peeling potatoes, men mending nets, children playing with tin soldiers on planks that rocked with the current. From some windows came laughter, from others, silence. The river was life and death both, indifferent to the distinction. And somewhere along its length, Maigret felt sure, the stranger's presence lingered, whether in gloves drifting, unseen, or in the hush of voices that fell silent when questioned too directly. Night fell, and with it the fog thickened, swallowing lamps into halos. The Seine rolled black and patient beneath the bridges. Maigret leaned once more on the parapet, pipe embers glowing like a tiny beacon in the mist. He did not think in terms of clues or suspects. He thought of rhythms, of how a man moved through a city, of what he left behind and what he sought to erase. Cigarette ends, coffee cups, a button, a thread, perhaps a bundle of cloth cast into the current. These were not yet answers. They were echoes. But the river, he knew, had a way of returning what it received in time, in its own chosen place. As he turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres, footsteps echoed behind him briefly, then vanished into the fog. He did not quicken his pace. He knew better than to chase shadows on the embankment at night. But the sound lingered in his ears like the memory of a voice unfinished. Somewhere the stranger was walking too, perhaps watching, perhaps only crossing a bridge as anonymously as any other Parisian. The gloves might still be on his hands, or they might already be floating downstream, their yellow fading into the darkness of water. Maigret climbed the stone steps to the street, his coat heavy with mist, his mind heavier still with the weight of rumour. Tomorrow perhaps a body would rise, or perhaps nothing would come, and the city would forget as quickly as it had invented. But he would not forget. For him, the river carried more than rumour. It carried inevitability. And as he entered the warmth of the quay, with its lamps glowing on wooden desks and its corridors alive with the shuffle of shoes, Maigret knew the case had shifted. It was no longer confined to cafes and cigarette stubs. It had entered the bloodstream of the city, flowing with the Seine itself, waiting for the moment when rumour would harden into fact and silence into revelation. The telegram arrived at noon, its language clipped and unsentimental. A room discovered on the Rue des Petites Écuries, rented under a false name, hastily abandoned 2 nights earlier. The landlord, suspicious only because the rent had been paid in advance, mentioned yellow gloves in passing. It was enough. Within the hour, Maigret was striding through the narrow street, his heavy steps echoing between facades stained with soot and damp, his hat brim catching the drizzle that had returned to veil the city. The house stood at the end of the street, wedged between a laundry and a tobacconist. Its shutters were half closed, its front door swollen with age and swollen further by the rain. The landlord was waiting, an anxious man in a threadbare waistcoat who smelled faintly of cheap cologne and nerves. He spoke quickly, as though eager to empty himself of the burden. The tenant had arrived quietly, paid for 2 weeks, carried no luggage but a single valise, and left without warning. He had left the key in the lock, the room untouched except for traces that unsettled the landlord more than disorder would have done. Maigret climbed the creaking stairs slowly, pipe clamped between his teeth, letting the old wood complain beneath his weight. The corridor was dim, lit only by a small window at the far end that gave onto a wall as blank as a tomb. The landlord fumbled with the key, pushed open the door, and stepped aside. The room breathed emptiness. A narrow bed pressed against the wall, its sheets pulled tight as though no one had slept there. A chair sat square to the table, pushed in carefully, as if awaiting its absent occupant. On the table itself a single object lay, fragile and deliberate, one yellow glove, its fingers splayed as though the hand had just withdrawn. Dust filmed the floor, except for a narrow trail where shoes had paced from door to window and back again. The window was unlatched, the curtains drawn hastily. Maigret crossed the room with his slow, deliberate tread. He picked up the glove with both hands, studying it as though it were alive. The leather was supple, worn, bearing creases that remembered the shape of a hand. Its mate was missing. The emptiness of the room seemed to concentrate around that absence, as though the missing glove were more present than the one remaining. Maigret held it to his face, inhaled faintly, and detected again that curious scent. Neither perfume nor sweat, but something sharp, medicinal, like spirits used to cleanse wounds. He placed it back exactly where it had been, then lowered himself into the chair. The landlord shifted uneasily in the doorway, as though the inspector might accuse him of complicity. But Maigret ignored him. He sat, pipe smoke curling upward, eyes fixed on the window, where a faint film of soot lined the sill. A shape had rested there recently. Perhaps an elbow, perhaps a hand. He could imagine the man leaning, gloves still on, gazing into the courtyard below, listening to the muffled sounds of Paris. Waiting, always waiting. The washstand in the corner yielded a basin rinsed but not dried, droplets still clinging. A razor lay on the edge, wiped too carefully, the blade glinting in the dim light. No soap, no towel. In the hearth a few ashes remained, grey and fine, the residue of paper burned swiftly. Maigret stirred them gently with a matchstick, watching fragments rise like ghosts before collapsing into dust. He could make out nothing, no letters, no words, only the stubborn whiteness of destruction. The man had erased himself with care, but erasure leaves its own testimony. Lucas arrived an hour later, breathless from the rain, and Maigret sent him silently to fetch the neighbours. One by one they entered, women with aprons dusted in flour, men smelling of work and fatigue, each repeating variations of the same story. The lodger had been discreet, polite, never drunk, never loud. They remembered the gloves, of course. One woman said she had glimpsed him returning late at night, gloves gleaming faintly in the lamp's glow, face hidden beneath his hat. Another insisted she had seen him walking with a woman once, though she could not describe her except to say she wore dark shoes. Rumour already swelled in the corridor, voices overlapping, each insisting on the truth of their memory. Maigret listened without comment. He had learned long ago that contradiction was as valuable as coherence. He noted the hesitation, the small lies of pride when someone claimed to have seen more than they had, the fear in the landlord's eyes that his house might become infamous. He asked nothing of consequence, only let their words drift like the river's current, carrying silt and debris, until something solid emerged. When the neighbours had gone, Maigret remained alone in the room. The silence pressed close, as if the walls themselves held their breath. He lit his pipe again, the glow illuminating briefly the curve of his cheek, and stared at the single glove lying on the table. It seemed to him less an object than a message, left deliberately, a token not of carelessness, but of intention. To leave behind one glove was to confess incompletion, to mark absence more vividly than presence. He leaned back in the chair, let the smoke curl around him, and allowed his thoughts to wander. The stranger moved from café to café, leaving cigarette ends, untouched drinks, fragments of himself that could be read but not yet assembled. Now he had left a room, meticulously erased except for a single glove. Was it a taunt, a farewell, or merely the gesture of a man who understood the power of half-clues? Maigret did not know. He only felt the case deepen, shifting from curiosity into something darker. The shadow of dread touched him not through crime uncovered, but through the precision of concealment. As night fell, he rose, closed the window, and extinguished his pipe. He left the glove where it was, folded neatly on the table, as though returning a book to its shelf. Outside, the corridor was quiet, the neighbours retreating into their own rooms, whispering still of what they had seen or imagined. The landlord trailed him down the stairs, asking what it meant, what he should do. Maigret gave no answer. The meaning would not be forced. It would come as the river brought driftwood at its own time. On the street, lamps flickered uncertainly in the drizzle, their halos trembling in the mist. The tobacconist next door was closing his shutters, the laundry's steam vented into the cold night air. Maigret stood for a moment, hands deep in his pockets, hat low, staring up at the dark window where the room waited, silent, empty, yet charged with the weight of absence. He had been in countless rooms abandoned in haste, by thieves, by lovers, by fugitives, but rarely had he felt the deliberate calm of this one. It was not flight, but orchestration. He turned, walked slowly back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, and felt the city tightening around him. Cigarette ends, coffee cup, rumours in the river, and now a room with one glove and ashes in the grate. Each fragment pulled him deeper, and yet each resisted cohesion. Paris itself seemed to have conspired with the stranger, lending its fog and its rumours, its cafés and its river to shield him. But Maigret had lived too long among these streets to be deceived. The city might guard its secrets, but in the end it always confessed. He crossed Pont-au-Change as the Seine rolled black beneath him, carrying away the day's débris. He paused in the middle, pipe smoke drifting into the mist, and thought again of the room. A glove, a razor, ashes. Objects that should have been mute, yet spoke with the clarity of a confession. A confession not of guilt, but of existence. And in that moment, Maigret felt the shadow of the stranger closer than ever, as though somewhere in the fog another man paused on another bridge, bare hands hidden in his pockets, watching the same water, listening to the same silence. The river moved on, the lamps shivered in the night, and Paris waited. The city was restless, as though the fog itself carried whispers. Paris could never be called silent, but there were days when its noise became less the din of traffic and commerce than the murmur of countless lives brushing against one another, weaving stories, invisible yet palpable. It was in this atmosphere that Maigret moved, his heavy coat brushing the shoulders of strangers in markets, his pipe smoke mingling with the smoke of countless cigarettes lit and extinguished in doorways. The stranger in the yellow gloves had ceased to be a solitary figure. He had dissolved into the crowd, multiplying across districts and streets, until it seemed everyone had seen him, or thought they had. At the Gare de Lyon, a porter swore he had glimpsed the gloves on a man boarding the night train to Marseille. At Les Halles, a vegetable vendor insisted they had brushed against her stall, fingertips grazing the cabbages as if in idle curiosity. A student near the Sorbonne told friends he had seen them holding a book at the kiosk, though he could not recall the title, nor the face of the man who carried it. The gloves had become both more than real and less than real, a symbol wandering through the city's collective imagination. Maigret walked slowly through these reports, never dismissing, never fully believing. He had learned that crowds could manufacture certainty out of coincidence, but he also knew that within exaggeration lay the pulse of truth. He observed not the tales themselves, but the eyes that told them, the hesitations, the details repeated by those who could not possibly have spoken to one another. Faces blurred together, bakers dusted with flour, seamstresses in their shawls, clerks with ink-stained fingers, errand boys darting between carts. Each face carried its private burdens, Yet within their multitude, the stranger hid himself perfectly, like a fish moving within a shoal. At a theatre on Boulevard du Temple, the gloves appeared again. An usher described a tall man who entered just before the curtain rose, took a seat in the back row, and remained there without stirring. He left during intermission, abandoning the program on his chair. When asked if he recalled the man's features, the usher shook his head, embarrassed. "Only the gloves," he murmured, as if ashamed to have noticed nothing else. The program, when Maigret examined it, bore no mark of its owner except a faint indentation where fingers had pressed too firmly into the paper. The gloves, it seemed, left impressions even when absent. The inspector drifted into cafes where conversation buzzed like flies around a lamp. In each, he found someone ready to swear the stranger had sat among them, silent, gloved hands resting on the table, eyes hidden beneath his hat. In one cafe near Saint-Michel, a young woman with powdered cheeks insisted she had seen the gloves reach for a glass of vermouth. She claimed the man had smiled at her, though she admitted she could not recall the shape of his mouth. It was the gloves she remembered, gleaming faintly against the glass. She laughed nervously as she spoke, as though uncertain whether she was confessing or inventing. Maigret allowed her laughter to fade without comment. He had no use for adornment. He listened for consistencies, the rhythm of appearances, the hours chosen, the places frequented. The stranger was not random. He gravitated toward thresholds, stations, lobbies, theatres, cafes, places where people gathered briefly before moving on. He lived not within walls but within transitions, the fleeting moments when one face blurred into another. That was his refuge. As dusk fell, Maigret wandered through the markets of Les Halles. Gas lamps burned low, casting a yellow sheen over the heaps of vegetables and crates of fish. The crowd pressed thick, merchants shouting, carts rattling, women bargaining with fierce voices. And yet, amid the tumult, Maigret felt it again. That subtle current of attention, the sense of being observed even as he observed. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the mass of faces, tired, eager, sullen, amused. For an instant he thought he glimpsed them, pale against a dark coat, resting on a sack of potatoes. But when he pushed forward there was nothing, only the rough laughter of porters and the sting of onions in the air. He did not curse the illusion. He accepted it as part of the hunt, the way a fisherman accepts the tug of a current without mistaking it for a catch. The stranger had made himself a rumour precisely by hiding in plain sight, by becoming part of the rhythm of the city. To pursue him was to pursue Paris itself, its endless tide of faces and gestures. That night, in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret leaned back in his chair, pipe glowing faintly, while Lucas and Janvier waited for orders. On his desk lay a scattering of objects collected over weeks: the cigarette ends, the broken thread, the single glove, the abandoned program. They seemed paltry against the vastness of rumour outside the window. Yet Maigret studied them with the patience of a man accustomed to silence. He knew the city would soon grow impatient. Already the newspapers hinted at a mystery swelling in the streets, a phantom haunting cafes and quays. Soon the press would christen him, inflate him, make of him a legend. But Maigret was less concerned with legends than with lives. He thought of the woman at the window in Angoulême, of her silence, her watchfulness. He thought of the cigarette ends pressed neatly into ash, of the untouched coffee cooling beside them. These were not gestures of a ghost. They were human habits, deliberate, restrained. Somewhere beneath the rumour lived a man of flesh and nerves, who smoked with precision, who leaned on window-sills, who left rooms in order as if tidiness could disguise flight. Outside, Paris pressed on, restless, indifferent. Street lamps quivered in the fog, footsteps echoed on bridges, laughter spilled from bars. The stranger might have been anywhere among them. A clerk, hurrying home with his collar up, a lover pausing beneath a window, a solitary drinker counting coins at the counter. He was no longer one face but many, a fragment dispersed among the multitude. To find him would require not force but stillness, the patience to let the crowd thin until one figure emerged by contrast. As the clock struck midnight, Maigret tamped down the ashes in his pipe and closed his eyes briefly. He pictured again the glove left on the table in that abandoned room, its missing twin haunting every rumour that followed. Perhaps the city itself had taken the other glove, wearing it invisibly, so that every passer-by became suspect. The thought was fanciful, and yet not entirely absurd. Paris was a city that could swallow a man whole and return only fragments. When he opened his eyes, the office was dim, the smoke hanging low like a curtain. He rose heavily, adjusted his hat, and stepped into the night. The Seine rolled black beneath the bridges, carrying whispers as steady as the current. Faces passed him in the gloom, tired workers, errant lovers, drunks staggering from cafes. He studied each briefly without urgency. Somewhere among them he knew the stranger moved too, perhaps brushing past him at this very moment, the scent of tobacco clinging, the memory of yellow leather lingering in the fog. And Maigret, steady as ever, followed not with haste but with certainty, letting the city itself be his net. For sooner or later a man cannot remain rumour. He must be seen, if only once, among the faces of the crowd. It began with a single column on the back page, a half-dozen lines tucked between advertisements for corsets and reports of municipal debates. The journalist had little more than rumour to work with, but he knew his readers hungered for mystery in the dull stretch of winter. He wrote of a man glimpsed in the fog, always in gloves the colour of faded sunlight, leaving cafes without drinking, slipping through stations without boarding, wandering Paris like an omen. The piece might have passed unnoticed, another fragment of the city's gossip, if not for the headline chosen with sly instinct, "The Stranger in Yellow Gloves." By the following week the phrase was on every tongue. Street vendors shouted it as they hawked the evening editions. Newsboys stretched it into a chant that echoed across boulevards. Customers leaned over zinc counters to argue about whether they had seen the stranger themselves or whether the whole invention was nothing more than a journalist's fancy. The gloves became legend faster than fact. Maigret read the first article in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe smoke curling above the paper. He frowned, though not from surprise. He had known it was coming. Rumour, once fed, always grew. The press, eager for sensation, had clothed the mystery in words sharper than any witness could manage. Now the stranger belonged less to himself than to Paris. Each new column embroidered the figure further. He was tall, he was slight, he was pale, he was swarthy, he spoke perfect French, or he never spoke at all. Details contradicted each other, yet none diminished the thrill. Soon letters arrived at the newspaper offices, penned in hurried hands, claiming encounters. A seamstress in Montmartre swore she had shared a bench with him beneath a lamp. A cab driver insisted he had carried him to the Gare de l'Est, where the stranger vanished into fog. One man declared he himself was the stranger, signing the letter with dramatic flourish. The editors printed it without checking, and Paris laughed, though the laughter carried unease. For Maigret this was the most dangerous stage. A mystery inflated by the press became harder to grasp, wrapped in layers of invention until truth suffocated. He had seen it before, how newspapers transformed petty thieves into masterminds, how they conjured motives more elaborate than reality could sustain. Now they did the same with the gloves. Each day's edition brought fresh speculation, each headline another veil between the inspector and the man he sought. He sent Lucas to speak with the editors, not to silence them, he knew too well that was impossible, but to listen. Lucas returned, shaking his head, muttering that the journalists were intoxicated by their creation. They admitted freely that they had little to go on, yet insisted the public demanded more. One editor even confided, half proud, that circulation had doubled since the story began. The stranger, he said, was good for Paris. He gave people something to talk about besides the weather and the price of coal. But Maigret was not convinced the city needed such a ghost. He saw the effect on witnesses. Already those who had spoken of the gloves now spoke with greater certainty, their memories reshaped by what they read. The woman who had hesitated when recalling the stranger's face now insisted she had studied him closely, describing features suspiciously similar to those printed in the newspaper sketch. A waiter who had first remembered only the gloves now added that the man carried a cane, a detail lifted wholesale from the latest article. Truth and invention had mingled, impossible to separate. Still, Maigret did not forbid the reading of newspapers in his squad. He watched his men as they pored over the columns, shaking their heads, trading cynical remarks. He knew even they, hardened by years of cases, could not help but be influenced by the legend swelling outside their windows. The press had turned the stranger into a riddle more intoxicating than any crime. Soon, Maigret thought grimly, someone would commit a crime in his name. And indeed, one morning, a body was pulled from the river near Austerlitz. The newspapers were quick to declare it the first victim of the stranger in yellow gloves, though the dead man had no mark of violence beyond the bruises of water. He was identified as a dock worker known to drink heavily, likely fallen by accident. But the presses cared little for likelihood. By the next edition, the man was a pawn, a casualty in the stranger's shadowy campaign. The gloves, they said, had been seen floating nearby, though the police found none. Maigret visited the morgue himself, the cold air wrapping him in silence. He studied the dockworker's swollen face, the cracked nails of his hands, and shook his head. This was no victim of an assassin's hand, but of the river's indifference. Yet he knew the truth would matter little. Paris preferred the legend. In cafes that night, voices rose with conviction. The stranger had claimed his first life. Back at headquarters, Maigret poured himself a glass of beer and sat in his chair, the pipe's ember glowing faintly. He thought of the stranger's precision, the neat cigarette ends, the folded gloves, the erased room. That man did not stumble drunkenly into water. That man did not kill by chance. If he killed at all, it would be with deliberation. But he had left no corpse, only traces, objects, half forgotten. The press gave him crimes he had not committed, turned absence into violence, and in doing so obscured whatever truth lay beneath. The inspector felt a heaviness in his chest, the familiar weight of responsibility. He was not chasing only a man now, but a myth sustained by a city eager to believe. Myths were harder to catch. They slipped through facts, growing larger each time one tried to grasp them. Yet Maigret had patience. He would wait for the myth to stumble, for the stranger to make the one gesture not foretold in print, the one gesture that belonged to a man, not to an invention. Late that night, walking home through fog, he passed a kiosk where newspapers hung in neat rows, their headlines shrieking of the stranger in yellow gloves. A group of boys crowded around, reading aloud, their voices rising with excitement. Maigret paused, watching their eager faces illuminated by the lamp's yellow glow. He felt the odd chill of knowing that somewhere, perhaps nearby, the stranger himself might be listening too, amused or enraged to find himself remade in ink. The Seine rolled black in the distance, carrying rumours as it carried debris. Maigret turned his collar up against the wind and walked on, his mind steady despite the clamour. The press could invent as much as it pleased. Sooner or later, invention would collide with reality. And when it did, Maigret would be there, pipe smoke curling in the silence, to separate man from myth. The newspapers had grown shrill with speculation, their columns swollen with invention. Every café table now seemed to host an argument. Who was the stranger in the yellow gloves? Where had he come from? And what had he done? In some versions, he was a seducer who abandoned women at the river's edge. In others, a thief of noble bearing who left tokens instead of plunder. The press no longer reported, they embroidered. And then, almost inevitably, came the moment Maigret had anticipated, the moment when fantasy provoked imitation. One afternoon, a young man presented himself at the Quai des Orfèvres, hat in hand, cheeks flushed with the strange courage of desperation. He asked to see the chief inspector directly. Maigret, hearing his name announced, glanced up from the haze of pipe smoke and agreed with a shrug. The youth entered, slim and pale, his collar worn, his eyes restless, as though rehearsing lines in his mind. He sat when told, folding and unfolding his hat on his knees, and at last blurted the words he had carried. "It was I. I am the one you seek, the man in the yellow gloves." Silence lingered in the office, broken only by the creak of a chair in the corridor. Maigret did not move. He let the words settle, as he always did, until their weight, or their emptiness, revealed itself. The young man's breathing quickened under the inspector's gaze. His hands twisted the hat brim until the felt lost shape. Finally, Maigret relit his pipe, puffed once, and said simply, "Tell me." The confession poured forth in torrents. The man claimed he had haunted the cafes, leaving cigarette ends and untasted drinks, slipping through stations, gliding along the quays. He spoke of the abandoned room, of the glove left on the table, of glances exchanged with women whose names he could not remember. He described everything the newspapers had described, everything whispered in markets and bars. His voice grew louder, eager, almost proud, until at last he faltered, realizing Maigret had not written a word. The inspector's expression was unreadable, heavy-lidded eyes fixed on the youth as smoke coiled upward. "And the river?" Maigret asked quietly. The man hesitated. "The river? Yes. I walked by it often." "You threw nothing in?" A pause, then a shake of the head. "Nothing." Maigret leaned forward, his large hands resting on the desk. "Why then come here?" The young man flushed, then paled. He stammered of guilt, of needing to unburden himself. Yet beneath the words, Maigret heard the hollowness, the too perfect cadence of one who had studied the newspapers, rehearsed lines, built an identity from ink. The inspector saw it often, men hungry for attention, for punishment even, who stepped into the shadow of crimes they had not committed. Paris, intoxicated by the myth, had birthed its first false prophet. He questioned, gently, patiently, pressing for details the press had not printed, the brand of cigarettes stubbed in the café saucer, the shape of the room's window, the exact odour that clung to the gloves. The answers came vague, halting, increasingly desperate. At last, the young man's shoulders sagged. His voice broke into a whisper. I thought it might matter if I said it." Maigret signalled to Janvier, who had been waiting outside, and the youth was led away, not to a cell, but to a bench where he would be offered food, warmth, and the slow kindness of disillusion. He was no murderer, no phantom. He was only another of Paris's lost souls, yearning for significance. When the door closed, Maigret sat back heavily. His pipe had gone out. He tapped the cold ash into the tray and felt the weariness of the city pressing on him. The case had become not only a search for a man, but a battle against shadows multiplied by imagination. How many more would come forward, wearing masks stitched from rumor? How many innocent lives would be entangled before the truth emerged? That evening, he walked home along the boulevard Saint-Michel. Students spilled from cafes, their voices bright with laughter, quoting the latest headlines as if they were scripture. A beggar shook his cup, muttering about gloves, certain he had seen them near the Luxembourg. Everywhere the figure was spoken into existence, stronger than fact, stronger than memory. Maigret listened without revealing himself, his pipe smoke drifting in silence. He thought of the real man because somewhere there was a real man, walking unnoticed in this same crowd, perhaps smiling faintly at his growing legend. The next morning, another letter arrived at the quay. This one was anonymous, written in a steady hand on cheap paper. "I am not the man you seek," it began, "but I have seen him." The writer described a solitary figure who sat at a counter, drank water only, and left behind a glove as if by accident. No location, no date, no name, only the image, repeated once more. Maigret folded the letter carefully, placed it among the other fragments on his desk, and stared at them with quiet determination. The false confession had changed nothing. It had only confirmed what Maigret already knew. The city was too eager, too fevered, to allow truth to stand alone. The gloves had become a symbol, and symbols invited impostors. But Maigret did not chase symbols. He waited for human error, for the moment when the man behind the legend betrayed himself, not in ink, not in rumor, but in the stubborn honesty of habit. That night, long after the clerks had gone and the corridors of the quay lay silent, Maigret remained in his office, the lamp casting a yellow pool over the scattered evidence. He thought of the dock worker misnamed as a victim, of the young man who confessed without cause, of the countless voices insisting they had seen what they wished to see. And beneath it all, he felt again the pulse of the stranger's real presence. Tidy, precise, patient, a man who left behind half-clues, not to boast, but to endure. Maigret lit his pipe once more and leaned back, eyes half-closed. He could almost sense the city breathing around him, restless, dreaming, inventing. Somewhere within that vast breath moved a man with bare hands, or gloved ones, a man who had not yet spoken. Maigret would wait. He had always been good at waiting. And when the stranger did speak, or when his silence grew unbearable, it would not be in the pages of a newspaper, nor in the hollow voice of a false confessor. It would be in the unmistakable language of a human life finally cornered by itself. And the winter fog hung thicker than ever, swallowing the city in its embrace. Paris had grown accustomed to its presence, the way a drowning man becomes familiar with the weight of water. The street lamps blurred into halos, their light diffused, muted by the haze that curled through alleys and pressed against windows. The city was a place of shadow and outline, where faces passed one another without recognition, and voices evaporated into the damp night air. The stranger in the yellow gloves had become one of those shadows, more myth than man, more rumor than reality. Yet Maigret could not dismiss him so easily. Each day the press continued to fuel the fire, spinning tales of abductions, disappearances, and cryptic clues. But the mystery, despite the frenzy it had ignited, had slipped from Maigret's grasp. It no longer felt like a singular case. It had grown into a phantom, not a person, and he found himself wondering if, in chasing the legend, he had allowed it to become more real than the man himself. Every time he thought he was closing in, the figure he pursued would slip through his fingers, melting into the city's fog like smoke. And yet Maigret did not abandon the search. For him, there was always something beneath the surface, a movement he could feel even when he could not see it. He understood Paris in ways that few could, its rhythms, its silences, the pulse of its heartbeat. He had learned, over the years, to listen to the spaces between the noise. It was in one of those spaces that the next clue appeared. It was not dramatic, not a discovery made in haste, but the steady unravelling of an invisible thread. A barmaid at a small tavern near the Place de la Concorde had noticed something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it had passed unnoticed by the others. It was the glove. Not the one left behind in a cafe, not the one found abandoned in a room, but a second glove, identical in every detail, worn by a man she could not describe, but whose presence she remembered. He had come in late, his face obscured beneath the brim of his hat, his coat soaked from the rain. He had ordered only a glass of water, then left again as quickly as he had entered. The barmaid had noticed the glove because it had caught the light. A glint of yellow leather that seemed too bright against the darkened wood of the bar. It was the way it had rested against the edge of the counter, neatly, with the careful precision of someone who understood how objects told stories. Maigret listened to the details, letting them sink in. There was nothing immediately useful in them, but there was something in the woman's voice that intrigued him. Something in the way she hesitated before mentioning the gloves, as though she had been reluctant to draw attention to it. The tavern, like many in Paris, was nestled in the shadow of larger structures, a place where the noise of the city seemed distant, softened by the weight of history and age. Maigret took his time walking there, his footsteps steady on the damp cobblestones. When he arrived, the tavern's low wooden door creaked open with a familiar sound, as though the building itself had long since accepted the comings and goings of men. Inside, the warmth of the fire pushed against the chill of the air, the low murmur of conversation blending with the clink of glass and the occasional crackle of the hearth. The barmaid was still there, her hands busy with the cleaning of glasses, but her eyes flickered up when Maigret approached. He ordered a glass of wine and sat at the counter, his large frame filling the space with the quiet authority that so often made others uneasy. He let the moments stretch between them, not rushing her, but giving her time to remember, to find the words that had previously eluded her. Finally, after a few exchanges about the weather and the day's work, she spoke again. "I remember it clearly," she said, her voice lower now, almost as if she were confessing something private. He came in just before closing, his coat dripping. He was in no hurry, but something about him was off. Like he didn't belong, like he wasn't really part of the world around him. And the gloves, of course. They were yellow, like the ones you read about in the papers. I only noticed them because they were so bright, so out of place. He didn't say much, just ordered the water, stared at the glass like he was waiting for something. And then he was gone. I don't know how to explain it, but it wasn't like any other customer I've had. Maigret took his time responding, letting the weight of her words sink in. There was something here, something small yet telling. A man who did not belong, who waited for something invisible, a stranger whose gloves glinted in the dim light like a promise of something he could not fulfill. Maigret's thoughts wandered to the many stories he had heard about the man, the countless faces that had blurred together in his search. Was this the stranger? Or was it yet another shadow cast by the city's endless fog? He thanked the barmaid and left, his thoughts heavy with what he had heard. The glove once again had appeared, But this time it was not the only clue, nor was it the one that carried the greatest weight. It was the feeling, the impression the man had left behind, the sense that he was waiting for something that never came, something the city had promised him and then failed to deliver. The streets had emptied by the time Maigret returned to his office. The fog had thickened, and the lamps stood like sentinels in the dark, casting their dull glow over the wet pavement. Inside, the office was quiet, except for the steady hum of typewriters and the faint murmur of voices from the corridor. Maigret sat at his desk and opened the file once more, reviewing the notes, the fragments of the case. The gloves had become more than just an object. They were a symbol, a marker of something that was slipping through his fingers. They were the trail, yes, but they were also the smokescreen, the thing that drew attention to the wrong places. He had spent weeks following their outline, watching for their reappearance, when in fact they had only been the marker of a deeper game. He closed the file and stood, walking to the window where the city's lights flickered through the fog. He could not afford to chase shadows forever. The stranger had learned that just as Maigret had learned it. The city had become a labyrinth, and the stranger had taken its most convoluted path, leaving only whispers and half-clues behind. But Maigret was not deterred. He had never been one to let a case slip into the haze of the city's imagination. He would wait for the moment when the stranger could no longer remain hidden in the shadows, when the legend would finally meet the man. Maigret knew that sooner or later the stranger would make a mistake, a gesture too human, too imperfect for the myth he had become. And when that moment came, Maigret would be there, watching, waiting for the silence to break. For now the gloves remained in the fog, like an echo, like a breath. But Maigret was patient. He would wait until they finally fell, until the man who wore them could no longer hide behind the shadows of his own invention. Paris had many faces, and Maigret had seen them all. The stranger in yellow gloves was just one among many, but unlike the rest he would be found,